Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast, episode 38.
Welcome to the Out of Order Podcast, your window into the firearms community, exploring those shaping the future of our rights and protecting our lifestyle, laws, legal cases, activism, and self-defense in a candid and honest podcast for our brothers and sisters in arms. Here's your host, James Kalita.
Thanks for tuning in to the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. Today's guest is Dick Clarck from SilenceALawyer.com. Before I bring Dick on, wanted to remind you guys about NagYourRep.com. It is a free guide I put together to help you automatically and regularly contact your reps about how you feel about gun control. And now, here's Dick.
Dick Clarck, welcome to the show.
Thanks, James.
Great. So, Dick, you have the website, silencerattorney.com. Would you tell us a little about that?
Well, I practice principally in the area of firearms law in my private law practice. And what that means is I help a lot of folks who are in the process of acquiring a silencer, or what we often call a suppressor, a device to tame the muzzle blast from a firearm and make it a little more user-friendly and a little safer for bystanders. And so that, you normally wouldn't think of needing a lawyer in order to buy a gun, at least not in most places in the United States. But when we're talking about some of these more heavily regulated firearms and firearms accessories like silencers, there's a law that was passed in 1934 called the National Firearms Act, which makes it significantly more of a process, let's say, more difficult to acquire these items because we have to pay a tax and we have to register. And most people these days use what's called a trust, and a purpose-built trust that we'll refer to as a gun trust. And they use that because they want to perhaps enable other people to be in possession of these items that they own, and because they want to plan for how, this will unwind after their death and how those items get to where they need to go. Again, keeping in mind, this can be a complicated process for folks who have never done it before, and we need to sort of flag that for future responsible parties' attention, that, hey, we need to be extra careful that we follow the correct legal process when we're distributing this valuable property. So that's how a lot of people come into contact with me for the first time, is because they want to get a gun trust set up, and they just need help understanding what that process looks like of creating the trust, and then what that NFA registration process looks like. But, there's also dealers and manufacturers that I've helped understand from the other side, what kind of paperwork they're responsible for assembling when they send things off to the ATF, and what they can expect if a certain error is made here or there, and what the way to remedy that error might be. And so, it's complicated for both parties to the transaction, and there's a tax that has to be paid of $200 per item for most of these items, including silencers. So that is a lot of what I do. And then I also help people who aren't necessarily looking to get that kind of item, that kind of merchandise, but maybe just has lost their firearms rights. And so, for example, this could be somebody who way back in the past had some kind of a criminal conviction that's become a prohibitor for them. And that would include virtually any felony. The only exceptions would be some federal financial crimes that don't give you a lifetime firearms disability. But every other kind of felony, including all the nonviolent ones, essentially, can create this lifetime disability in your civil rights. And so I help people seek pardons, judicial set-asides, and other remedies that might be useful to them in getting those rights back, and showing that they're maybe ready to demonstrate they're not going to be a danger to anybody if they were to have that right restored. So, yeah, that's a lot of what I do in my private practice.
And you mentioned getting rights restored. I've heard that it can be very confusing for people convicted of crimes to know whether or not they are prohibited. Where a lot of times they'll take a plea or be convicted of something and not realize that it meets that definition of a felony. Is that there some truth to that?
Well, yeah, there is some truth to that, and also what may constitute a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. I think the sort of obvious conclusion that's wrong that a lot of people draw is that if you're not charged with a crime that in the statute is named, domestic assault or something like that, if it's not particularly a domestic violence crime, they think, oh, well, that might not apply to me. This federal prohibition that we've had around for a couple of decades for people who have a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. But in fact, it's not just a crime that's labeled a domestic assault, but anything with anybody who is a household member or family member or similarly situated to one of those people. And so what you can have is a confusing situation where, because it isn't a specifically, domestic violence crime, the way that it's titled, it doesn't get reported as a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, or there's inconsistent reporting. And so you may have somebody who's been issued a firearms permit of some sort, whether it's a concealed handgun permit or a firearm purchase certificate, which is something we have here in Nebraska, and maybe they've been issued those erroneously 3 or even 4 times, and renewed each time and not had a problem. And then the latest time they go in to renew, all of a sudden they're denied. And they're told that they have this prohibitor on their record. And so that can be obviously a very precarious situation if you've been told by the government for a decade that you could have a gun, and then out of the blue, you haven't committed any new crimes, but now your conviction has percolated up through the system and created a problem for you. And another example that doesn't have anything to do with committing a crime at all would be people who have been involuntarily committed to a mental hospital. And the classic case for this is where somebody says, or somebody claims that they said something about self-harm. And so, the police take that very seriously, and they can do what's called an emergency protective custody. But then what may follow is the county mental health board or local mental health board, however it's set up in your state, they may issue an involuntary commitment order, meaning ordering this person to be treated, complete treatment with some mental health provider. And it might even be an outpatient treatment. But still, if they're committed to the care of a mental hospital, that's going to create a lifetime disability. Even if it turns out, they're there for a few days and they really don't think that the threat's substantiated and there's no course of care recommended, there's still this disability that has to be fixed later with the help of a lawyer, usually, where we have to petition. In Nebraska, the way it works is we have to petition that mental health board at the county level and show them relevant medical records and provide character reference letters. And again, it can be quite an onerous process, assembling a lot of different moving parts together into this body of evidence that you hope will persuade that mental health board that this person's rights should be restored. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can come at it, and it may even be a situation where you technically aren't entitled to a concealed handgun permit, for example, even though you're not a prohibited person for purposes of owning a firearm. And so there's a lot of complexity to this stuff. It's kind of an inch wide but a mile deep. So
thank you. And so there's seems like there's a lot of complicated things going on with the law. So I read on your website that there is one of your legislators proposed a ban on silencers for Nebraska.
Yeah, there was a bill introduced that would have gone after, trigger activator devices. I mean, I think the introducer really was thinking of bump stocks there. And then it also included a blanket prohibition on silencers. There are there's at least one member of the Nebraska legislature, colleagues with this senator who introduced the bill, who in fact is a silencer owner. And so I know there was a little bit of friendly conversation there, just maybe to familiarize the introducer with some information she might not have been aware of before. And so even at hearing, she said that she wanted the silencer component amended out of the bill. And then that bill didn't ultimately go anywhere in any case. But yeah, it was a proposal that, made it at least to the first step of the legislative process. And there are some states that have tried to do that recently, or at least there's been a bill introduced to do that. But really, the momentum in recent years, certainly in the last decade, has been in the other direction, with states legalizing the possession of silencers. And my neighboring state of Iowa recently legalized silencers just within the past 4 or 5 years. And they also had to eliminate a statute that forbade the possession of short-barreled rifles and so on. And again, you can't possess those things without being in compliance with federal law. But some states have said, maybe the federal process is plenty onerous and we don't need to have a blanket ban on these things. So, yeah, it's I think the tide's really going in the other direction, and a lot of those bills that might be introduced to ban these sorts of things, well, I think a lot of them are more conversation starters than very serious policy proposals. So,
yeah, and that's great that you were able to get that removed from the bill, and that ultimately the bill didn't go anywhere. I'm originally from New Jersey, and tide up here seems to be going the entirely other way. They can't seem to come up with a firearms prohibition that they can't get passed, and they've come up with some crazy ones.
Sure.
So the gun trusts these are things you recommend for people purchasing a silencer, short-barreled rifle, and you say it helps them transfer the item between family members, or in case of inheritance?
Well, yes, there's the management of who gets the property after the creator of the trust, person that we call the grantor or the settlor, or the creator of the trust. After they pass away, the trust can outlive you. And in that sense, it can be a multi-generational estate planning tool, whereas a will speaks at death. Now, don't get me wrong, there is this misconception out there on some of the forums that somehow if you don't have the item registered to a trust, but it's registered to you individually, that, the black helicopter is going to come and take your silencers away, on the day that your death certificate issues or something. That's not quite how it goes. Okay. We can pass these items on as part of our personal estate, as part of our individual estate, I should say. And it's just a certain variety of personal property. Again, personal property with a few more bureaucratic strings attached to the transfer of, that we have to be a little more careful about how we distribute from an estate. But the issue is that most people don't have a will that has some, topic-specific direction as to NFA firearms. And the enemy here is ignorance, because, again, we have to pay a tax and we have to register when we transfer one of these NFA items, these National Firearms Act regulated items. And if we don't do it, there's criminal penalties. There's the potential for a felony prosecution. And certainly, even more likely than that is the potential for loss of the assets of the property. And this stuff is not cheap. So, of course, most gun owners want this valuable equipment that they've spent their money on to inure to the benefit of their loved ones when they pass. We're not going to take this stuff with us. And so when we use a trust, part of the benefit on the estate planning side, first of all, again, it's going to be multi-generational. So if the laws were to get worse and that next transfer is the pressure point where they try to take an opportunity to maybe deprive the family of the property, make it harder to transfer, right? Maybe we're putting off that next legal transfer for a couple of generations, or at least as long as our state law will allow under the rule against perpetuities. And I think that is, it gives comfort to some people that there might be that option to buy the family a little bit of time with this firearms heritage that's obviously very important to a lot of folks. And now that's the estate planning benefit. But I like to tell people that, when I am doing these gun trusts, I have a very unusually young client for an estate planning client. Most young guys in their 20s are typically not really excited about going and paying a lawyer to prepare estate planning documents, because that's probably not a lot of it what's on their mind. But a lot of times it is a younger guy who is coming across, my inbox as somebody who's interested in creating a gun trust. And so a lot of times I think I'm the first one that's ever talked to some of these folks about, hey, what's going to happen when you die and where's your property going to go? And so, but we get that squared away, and we provide in a purpose-built gun trust things that basically just make the trustee a little more wary and conscious of the restrictions that exist on transferring these items. And so that's all well and good on the estate planning side, but really that's not why these young estate planning clients are coming my way. Because again, most of them are not that interested in the general topic of estate planning. They're coming to me for another benefit that we can call co-ownership. And that's just the idea that, again, the transfer of these items is heavily regulated. And so if we have, let's say, an individually registered silencer, and so let's say you've got your individually registered silencer, and you've got a couple of them. And so you're going out hunting, and you're going to send your hunting buddy out to the other side of the section of land that you're hunting on with one of your suppressed rifles while you stay on this side. Well, that's a problem, because as soon as that person leaves your sort of immediate physical vicinity, and they're independently in possession of that item, then you could really be in the position for somebody to have a criminal prosecution against them proceed for unlawful possession of an NFA item that's not registered to them. However, if we use a trust, the trust is the registered owner as far as the ATF's records are concerned, and you can have multiple people acting as trustees, sort of administrators of the trust. And so because we can have multiple people who are legally entitled to act on behalf of the trust, now we've just made it possible for multiple people to possess and use this property independently of each other. Now, another thing that a gun trust will typically do, if it's properly drafted, is it will authorize to do something that authorize the trustee to do something that a trustee is usually never allowed to do, and that's what I just mentioned: to use the property. You know, if you think about the trust agent down at your bank or whatever, who's managing the money for for Daddy Warbucks on behalf of little orphan Annie. Of course, the guy at the bank is not allowed to make his Maserati payments out of those financial assets that he's managing, right? That he's managing them for the benefit of the beneficiary. So that's the typical rule in trust law. But with a gun trust, part of what we're trying to accomplish is to enable another person that we're going to call a trustee to be able to use the property. So we're going to draft around that default rule in a gun trust because it serves our purpose here. So that's a good piece of drafting in this purpose-built sort of trust. It would be a terrible provision in a trust that's more about management of financial assets or real estate or what have you. So, but that's why these gun trusts can be useful, though, is to enable others to possess these items during our lifetime. And even more important than the fun cases that that I described, the hunting buddy or the shooting buddy or whatever, it probably is the spouse. Somebody who's home when I'm not, who has access to the contents of my safe when I'm not present. Maybe a spouse isn't even interested in the firearms. A lot of times only one, maybe only the husband's interested in guns and the wife isn't, or maybe it's the other way around. But if that other spouse has the combination to the safe, if I'm not home, my wife can be considered to be in possession of the contents of that safe if she can open it, even if she never does, because we could describe that as a theory of constructive possession, or even if a person hasn't actually laid their hands on something, because they had the ability to exercise that dominion and control over that item, the state can claim that they're in possession already. So that's a gray area that we just don't want to put our loved ones in. And,
Sure.
I jokingly say, I'd get in enough trouble when I buy a new gun. I don't know what kind of trouble I'd get in if my wife got arrested over it, So that, I would just rather avoid that altogether and keep the loved ones protected. And again, have that flexibility for some other adult to be able to possess those items if I can't, so.
Oh, and so how did you get into all of this? I mean, did you go to law school intending to specialize in firearms law, or?
No, I was a gun guy a long time before I was ever a lawyer or knew I was going to be a lawyer. My dad was a shooter, not really a hunter, but, I grew up doing a little bit of target shooting, and really in the Boy Scouts, fell in love with just kind of sitting down at that shooting bench and getting the breath control in order and getting that good sight picture, and, just almost a sort of meditative experience when you kind of get in the zone and do that target shooting. And so rifle shooting merit badge, shotgun shooting merit badge. I ended up helping to teach both of those, as well as archery. And, so just really love those sorts of field sports, as we call them, at a Boy Scout camp. And I worked in a gun store when I was in college. That was a part-time job that I worked. And so understood the business that way, more from the business side of it, from the industry side, at least at that retail level. Worked gun shows almost every weekend during that time. And so I still, though, as much as I enjoy guns and have occupied a lot of my sort of recreational time with them and even some of my work time, I went to law school, didn't really cross my mind that there'd be any related work out there after I got out and hadn't even, considered it. But then a few years later, I was working in the governor's office here in Nebraska as a policy advisor to Governor Dave Heineman. And, like I said, I didn't really grow up hunting, but grew up shooting. And I thought, okay, well, I'm in Nebraska and there's some pretty fine hunting to be had here. So I'm going to start learning that. And I'm going to watch YouTube videos and figure it out and, trial and error, right? And so I went out one day to some public land locally, local here to Lincoln where I live. Had a banner day on the doves, shot a box full of shells and, shot 8 doves and found 6 of them and brought them home. And I just got back in the truck and I could just hear the damage I had done to my hearing, because while I'm very faithful about wearing hearing protection every single time when I'm at the shooting range, when you're hunting, they call it hunting and not shooting for a reason, right? Most of the time when you're hunting, you're walking around observing what's around you, trying to find your quarry or waiting for your quarry to come to you. And so that 5 cents or 4 cents engagement with the world around you is an important part of the experience. And so like most hunters, I wasn't wearing hearing protection. And so I've got some persistent ringing in the ears, tinnitus, right, from that to this day. And that is the single experience that got me interested in silencers. And so I went through the process myself, and ended up having to get help from another attorney who was familiar with this area, because even as a guy who was pretty familiar with guns, guy who had done well in a class on trust in law school, it was just really kind of a difficult thing to wrap my mind around, this little area of how these items are regulated. And so once I had gotten through it, I realized, boy, there's a lot of gun guys around here that are not lawyers. And so they're going to have even more of a time dealing with this stuff, trying to figure it out than I have. So maybe there's a few places where I can help on that. And so I started doing that kind of work on nights and weekends. And now I've done, probably somewhere around 575 gun trusts in the past 5 years. So I've done a few of them, and there was a need, and a lot of dealers started putting people in touch with me just because I can explain how the transaction process works to the customer. So that saves the dealer some headache, and it ends up with a customer who's better informed and is probably going to carry out more transactions because he's comfortable with the process. So,
wow, that's great. And so I've been asking all my guests if there are books they recommend that every gun owner should read, whether liberty or legal or gun related.
Sure. Well, that's a good question. I think that lately, something that's really important for everybody to remember is that guns are not just for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, right? Everybody has a right to life. Everybody, regardless of their race, creed, ethnic extraction or whatever, has that same interest in protecting their lives and protecting the lives of their loved ones. And I think that the more that we effectively communicate that, the less the issue of guns will seem like a divisive one to people, because we talked about this last year at a conference put on by the National Shooting Sports Foundation and some others. Second Amendment Foundation. And that was the look, we've got to let everybody realize that, when they are worried about danger in their community, this isn't just one community that has the problem of violence and violent aggressors occasionally being around, right? And so we have to make people from all communities feel welcome in being educated on this topic. And boy, that's something that, there's a great book called The Negro and the Gun, and it talks all about the, just the history of the civil rights movement being a story of people who recognized that being armed was in their interests as people who were trying to reform society and make it a more, just and pro-liberty social order. And that is a critical part of the message that so many people don't get right now. They don't understand that there were people called the deacons of defense who were armed, who protected a lot of the notable civil rights leaders. And right now, when we have people marching in the streets for whatever cause, and a lot of times I wouldn't agree with their policy conclusions, what it is they're asking for policymakers to do, but maybe I agree with them on some of the symptoms. We agree on the symptom being bad that we all see as a social problem, and they just have a very different policy proposal to solve that symptom, to cure that symptom, right? And so I think that everybody needs to realize that speech, the kind of speech that people are trying to freely express, that's addressing the social problems they see, it goes hand in hand with knowing that you can protect yourself against people who might violently oppose your position. And again, we've all got the right to express the way we see things, and maybe don't have the right to make people listen, but we ought to be able to feel secure that we can do so and not have violence visited against us because we're helpless. And that's part of what's important about being armed too, is, the person who's unpopular, the person who has, a lot of people that don't like them, that's the person who has the greatest need to resort to defense maybe. And so that's the thing that may be the hardest, because maybe those are the people that we aren't so comfortable seeing in the gun store. And, that's something we all have to work on in ourselves, I think. So. Thank you.
That is excellent advice. And where can people find you online?
Well, you can go to my website at dickclarklaw.com. It's also silencerlawyer.com. That's a redirect. And during the day, I work in the Nebraska legislature as legal counsel to the Judiciary Committee. That's unrelated to my private law practice. But I do have the pleasure of working for the highest elected libertarian in the United States right now, Senator Laura Ebke, and you can learn a little bit more about her at lauraebke.com. So that's what I dedicate my daytime hours to, and right now I get to enjoy lots of nighttime and weekend hours with my friends in the gun community, helping them to exercise their rights. So,
great, Dick, I thank you so much for coming on the show. And any parting words for our listeners?
No, just remember that. Sometimes the best way to become less scared of a scary thing is familiarity and understanding. And a lot of times it's easy to, poke the bear, just throw barbs at that person who is the gun grabber or the hoplophobe or whatever pejorative term we want to use. But boy, if we could just try to assume good faith with our interlocutors and try to see their problem that they're seeing, so we can give them information that, if they're acting in good faith, if they're really trying to find the answer, boy, let's enable them to find it. Because I think our answer is the right one. I think liberty is the correct solution to the social problems that we see, and let's be good stewards of that message that liberty is for everybody. So,
great. I thank you very much for being on the show, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me, James.
Thanks for tuning in to the Out of Order Gun Rights podcast. Today's show notes page, outoforderjameskalita.com/Dick. You'll find links to his website, to the books we talked about, and of course, you'll find a link to nagyourrep.com, or you can just type that URL in and get that free guide we put together to help you automate and schedule the messages you send about gun control to your elected representatives. Out of Order, James Kalita, and we'll see you next time.